Welcome to A Scientist Walks Into a Bar. I'm your host, Amanda Thomas, and today we're here for a long conversation with a scientist who is very busy these days. Dr. Frank Franklin has a PhD in epidemiology, a JD, which means he's a lawyer, and he has a master's in public health. He's the Principal Epidemiologist and Director of the Epidemiology, Analytics, and Evaluation Division at the Multnomah County Health Department. And just so you know, Multnomah County is home to Portland, Oregon, where both Dr. Franklin and I live. Dr. Franklin has spoken at a couple of our Science on Tap events in person back in 2018, when we could do that, on the topic of racism, poverty, and public health. I invited him on the podcast because I wanted to talk to him about his professional experience working as an epidemiologist during this pandemic, and about the intersection of the current Black Lives Matter protests and his work in public health. I also wanted to give him an opportunity to talk about his own experiences being an African-American scientist. As you'll hear, we had a lot to talk about. A quick note, there was a bit of background noise in the recording. At one point, a train went by, but we've done what we can to remove the extra noise. With that, here we go. We know each other because you spoke, I invited you to speak at one of our in-person Science on Tap events, actually a couple of them back in 2018, on the topic of racism, poverty, and public health. And that's a huge amount of information. And I this is perhaps going to be a little bit difficult, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyway. Would you be able to condense some of what you talked about at those events into just a brief overview of what you talked about?
Yeah. Basically, in short, the idea of the talks, and when I've given similar talks like that, is to sort of thread together the connection between racism, poverty, and public health, because that's the area that I work in. But essentially, it's the connection between racism, poverty, and well-being, right? Which is inclusive of physical health, but also mental health, and whether or not a person is actually functioning well in their day-to-day activities. A lot of that well-being is often overlooked, or it's what I call the invisible piece of well-being.
When we are not in pandemic times, how does that influence your work? What do you do? What would you be doing on a normal day?
That seems so long ago.
Right?
Oh, man. I think most of my time is pretty much probably these days, I would say maybe, I would like to say 60-40, but it's probably 70-30 administrative work as it relates to epidemiology, data, analytics. I'm fortunate enough to have a large team of very smart people who do a lot of the day-to-day practicing or running the numbers. We do a lot of workshopping together, but most of my time I spent sort of making sure that there's an architecture in place, or trying to develop an architecture for Multnomah County so that epidemiology or population health information is available in a way that it's fluid, reliable. Also looking at our infrastructure to support data and moving that data into business intelligence, and moving that business intelligence into decision support for leaders across the department. And sometimes that looks like developing MOUs for data use agreements, developing contracts with external partners for data use agreements. How are we going to share data? How are we going to move it across systems and within systems within the department? So I bring that knowledge of data analytics and epi to that space, but I spend a lot of time making sure the structures are in place for those teams that need to use it. Most of them are in my department, but sometimes they're across other divisions and for the department's leadership to make decisions.
How does that differ from what your life is right now?
Wow. So right now, it's funny that you mentioned that. It's similar, but it's everything, as you probably could imagine, is now refracted or through the lens of COVID, right? Ironically, most of the work that we were doing supports COVID, but of course we didn't have COVID at the time, right? And so trying to make sure that things that we're working on, maybe now we need to be working on them a little bit more intensely, a little bit more intentional in terms of looking at shifting timelines to get things up and running more quickly, such as data dashboards, chronic disease surveillance, and more importantly, I should say just as important, morbidity surveillance. And the reason that's important is because that ties into a lot of the language that has become very popular since COVID is these underlying chronic conditions. So health departments traditionally, not just Multnomah, but health departments, whether they're federal, state, local, we've done very good as a public health system to sort of capture what I call the bookends of the life trajectory with vital records. We're very good at capturing birth records, and we're very good at capturing death records, but we have not been very strong or as equally robust to capture chronic diseases as people are actually living, right, throughout their life. And that's what we call morbidity.
And some of those chronic diseases were things that you touched on in your talks on racism, poverty, and public health. I've heard that health outcomes for people of color and in particular, Black Americans are particularly dire, including much higher rates of heart disease and chronic conditions. And you hear that some people say that that's because of genetics, but the data show otherwise. It's my understanding. So can you talk about how race affects a person's health?
Well, race similarly, race sort of structures people in society, and and when I say that, it's similar to sort of how gender, race, income, education, class, maybe sexual orientation as well. There's a whole host of them, but the ones that are most common that we often hear about is education, income, occupation, race, and gender. And race in particular, like the others, it positions you in society socially, and it helps determine the probabilities of being exposed to opportunities. It also structures what people call vulnerability and susceptibility. And vulnerability is more about the likelihood of being exposed to something negative. Could be positive, but we often think of in terms of something negative. And susceptibility is, given that exposure, the likelihood you'll be able to overcome it or won't succumb to it. And another way of looking at it is resiliency, right? The likelihood of being able to sort of get through those negative exposures that we all have in life, some acute, some chronic. But unlike the other areas such as gender, income, education, class, race is probably the one that is either the least mutable or not mutable at all, right? So that it makes it a little bit more unique compared to the other categories of gender, income, education, and occupation, or sexual orientation and gender identity. However, they all work similarly, if that makes sense.
Right. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that with sexual identity or class or something like that, that there is the ability for somebody to maybe pass or change a class that they're in and change their position in society to some extent, whereas somebody who is not white, that is not open to them. Am I understanding you?
Exactly. Right. So like race is race. Once you're in this country, once you're like Black, white, or whatever the category is, that's it, right? Where if you have education, you have income, you have occupation, sometimes those categories will allow you to sort of assuage or mollify or buffer negative events, right? However, race is one that obviously you can't change. And most of that sort of positioning is tied to racism.
I know when you spoke at our event, you spent some time talking about the school to prison pipeline and how that impacts people of color and particularly boys. Can you talk a little bit about that and what it is and how that affects communities?
Sure. I used school to prison pipeline as a way to sort of thread this idea of how race and racism negatively impacts African Americans generally from the home across their entire trajectory. And essentially, most of the school systems or the public school systems or the urban school systems, or just those school systems that have a large number of African Americans or Black and brown people, often are not as equipped to engage students from those backgrounds of sometimes being underrepresented economically, low income households, or some form of traumatic experience that those children may be experiencing. And this is not in every case, but in a lot of urban communities or a lot of the individuals that we see who are impacted by poor health outcomes across their lifespan, they're usually people of color or people who are lower socioeconomic status, such as poor white Americans as well. So it works similarly, but not quite exactly the same. So coming from what I call a violent experience, and when I say violent, it doesn't necessarily mean a physical assault. I mean, sometimes when you're in conditions that support traumatic experiences, I call that a form of violence, right? And the schools are not equipped to manage that. And often what they do is either amplify or make the problem worse. And then that in turn sets the child on a trajectory. And the school is a really good example because this is where the child spends most of his or her time outside the home. And it was a good example to show because a lot of African American, particularly boys, after the third grade or somewhere between the second and fourth grade, but typically around the third grade, if they're not successful in that third grade, it sets them up for arguably a long road of tough experiences. What the data has shown is that those individuals or those African-American boys who do not succeed well in the third grade often have higher rates of dropout, often have higher rates of poor performance, which then leads to perceived behavior problems. And then the child gets labeled as a bad kid or a person who has a bad attitude. And then those children are also more likely to become involved in the justice system. So therefore, you have this lifespan that has been forever interrupted simply because most school contexts are not supportive of meeting that child where he or she is. And often that context is also as equally traumatic. So it was just a way to thread sort of how when you take populations that are disadvantaged or experiencing discrimination and racism, there's a lot of tools you have to have in your tool chest to sort of manage that and engage that in a healthy way and really look at the family as a whole. And public school systems, in my opinion, they've been working on it, but it's been a process. I won't say that they haven't tried or that they haven't made strides.
And public school systems are woefully underfunded.
Correct.
I remember from your talk, you describing the third grade cutoff, not cutoff necessarily, but the indication that, and being shocked that it was that early and that precise of a measure.
Right. Yeah, I think I labeled it, I called it at the time, the third grade phenomenon, because as I was doing the research, and I often get pulled into a lot of different areas outside of just health and epidemiology, just because there's so many factors that contribute to health and well-being, and education being one of them. So colleagues that I've worked with in higher ed have been gracious enough to allow me to work with them on different projects. So I couldn't quite understand what was so significant about the third grade. You know, what was the big change between third grade and fourth grade, or fourth grade and fifth grade? Like what happens there? And after some thought and checking in with some of my colleagues, it was more about that's a pivotal point in elementary school regarding learning how to read and comprehend information. Up until third grade, you're learning how to read. But after third grade or so, the expectation is that you're reading to learn. So you have to develop this skill of learning how to teach yourself. But if you haven't really learned how to read, it becomes almost impossible to read in order to learn.
If a child who is in third grade who is having trouble with reading comprehension and may not have one or both parents at home because their parents also had trouble and are now into the justice system, and it's just a perpetual cycle. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, in some instances, you have situations like that, which I would say probably, there's a gradient. Some individuals are coming from households that are less stable. And when I say stable, it doesn't necessarily mean that they move around a lot. There's this the idea of housing stability that is associated with being transient in housing. But there's also this idea of, I like to think of it is, although the household, the family unit has not lived a transient experience, so to speak, is there stability within the household? How is the household functioning? And sometimes that may involve a single parent household, or may involve a two-parent household where the household in itself may experience a lot of what I call under-resourced, right? And that leads to a certain set of conditions where the child's under sort of constant stress. That is also one of those things where we call it's often called adverse childhood experiences. So they're under constant stress, and it could be some forms of emotional stress. Could be physical abuse, but not necessarily. There's a lot of stressors that children internalize that often has nothing to do with being physically assaulted. But when that comes into the school system has been historically ill-prepared to deal with that across the entire spectrum of that household experience. So, for instance, you could have a two-parent household where both parents are there, both parents are working, but they just don't have the time necessarily to pour into the children just because they're both working, maybe away from home, or they maybe the kid has to work or something like that. So it's not always necessarily a bad household, but it doesn't necessarily support a more robust developmental experience, or it can interfere with that experience. And so when the schools receive this child, historically, schools have always focused on ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. However, over the last probably 20 or 30 years, arguably, you really have to look at the child in his or her own household experience. And when you're inviting that child into the classroom, you're really inviting that child's family context into the experience, into the classroom. And you have to have a reasonably good understanding of that in order to have an affect or effectuate stronger outcomes.
Right. And as we are recording this in mid-July 2020, there's obviously a pandemic going on and obviously protests going on. And that's going to make, the question about whether schools are going to open or not is going to make this question also more difficult. How are you managing all of this, or are you involved in any of those decisions?
Well, I have to say it's tough because, as we all know, I mean, the virus, not only sort of in terms of its virology or the nature of the virus itself, it's constantly changing, right? And because of the way it operates in our community in terms of being highly incommunicable, we're constantly having to adapt to it. It's been a constant state of vigilance and working under what we call emergency operations. And sometimes you have the answers and sometimes you don't. But the goal is to make sure you have enough information to make the best answer given the circumstances that you deal with at the time. And so it's been challenging, to say the least.
I can't even imagine. I know that there have been people who have been critical of the protests for many reasons, some ideologically, but others because they are saying, oh, well, that's you go down there, you're around a bunch of people and you're going to get COVID because of your proximity to those people. What are your thoughts about the protests just in general? I don't want to direct you too much, but what do you think?
In general?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much we could talk about with the protests and our. I don't even know where to start, frankly.
I would say in general, just as COVID has sort of underscored or highlighted many of the fractures and fissions that we have in our society and in those systems that help support our day-to-day living, I think it has also highlighted and underscored the condition of African Americans and people of color in the United States. And again, a lot of these things, whether it's the factors that have been the catalyst for the protests or whether it's some other infrastructure systems in terms of healthcare delivery or something as simple as, which seems simple to me because I don't do the work, but I'm sure it's very complicated, just managing a city to make sure the trash is collected, right? Or to make sure that people have enough supplies of things that we take for granted. It is pointed to a lot of the things that we have underinvested in, I think, as a society. And one of those is obviously racism and discrimination and race relations and how that impacts us as a whole.
I remember seeing something recently where somebody said that future historians will look back and say, "Oh, what quarter of 2020 do you study? Which few months?" Because there's just so much going on.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. So I'm happy to talk more about what's going on currently, and if you have anything else you want to bring up, I want to welcome you to do that. But I also want to talk to you about being a scientist, because part of why I am doing these podcast interviews is because I want to give people an opportunity to learn more about who scientists are and what they do and what they're like. And so what got you interested in epidemiology?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that. I think I appreciate the opportunity, not necessarily to speak on all scientists, but at least since I'm part of that community. Since the pandemic now, everyone knows what an epidemiologist is. I used to always have to explain it between a entomologist or a dermatologist. And all of a sudden, epidemiologists, we've become very sexy in the media, so to speak, right? What got me into epidemiology? I think I've always been interested in science, even in high school. science and math, and there's a whole host of reasons for that. And I went to college. I majored in science and stuck with it and worked in a couple of labs. At one point, my goal was to become an immunologist, and I thought I would get a PhD in immunology. I decided against that. Still wanted to stay in the field where I could use my background in science and continue to move that forward. But I wanted my work to be somewhat more socially relevant, or having opportunities to engage the broader sort of society or the broader social context, compared to what my perception of when you do what we call as bench work. It's a very narrow field. And arguably, people could say the same thing about epidemiology, but it's most of that work doesn't necessarily as frequently permeate into the broader social context as epidemiology.
What was important to you about having a broader social context?
No, I think after working in the labs, and I was just out of college maybe about 2 or 3 years out. And when I would get together with my friends, which you often do, I think when you first get out of college, you're just so glad to be out making a little bit of money, and you start talking about, what is your work? I found my work to be very fascinating. I worked in breast cancer and ovarian cancer, but I realized I couldn't have a conversation with most of my peers because it really would take someone who's at the bench to understand that. And I've always wanted my work to have some type of impact beyond me, but also balancing with the type of person that I am. There's a part of me that I like a certain level of isolation to read and to think. So I could never necessarily just be like someone constantly out socially or at the forefront of, in front of the camera all the time. However, I felt like my science should be able to engage the current conditions in which I live in. And what felt more relevant to me, of course, again, I'm 24, 25 or something, was the urban environment, urban health, particularly violence. And so when I learned about public health, and I learned of the components, the two of the major areas of public health, and we like to say the backbone of public health, but I'm sure my colleagues would not like that because we have a friendly rivalry, but biostatistics and epidemiology. And that allowed me to use that work to engage conditions on the ground, and learning that public health in itself is political. And so, although a lot of the things I work on, they don't necessarily pivot into an outcome immediately, but it has more of a direct impact. It's more adaptable to speaking to sort of where we are in the current time, contemporary times.
You also have a law degree. And how did that happen? How did you decide that you wanted to go to law school as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I was training for my public health degree at Morehouse School of Medicine, I took a class called Epidemiology in the Law. Public health law. It's called public health law. That was my first introduction to, I would call the sort of coexistence between public health and the law. The purpose of the course obviously is an introductory course to sort of have students understand the legal infrastructures that are in place that support and drive public health practice. Outside of that, it also sparked my interest in terms of other types of law that impact health outcomes outside of just the actual statutory frameworks that drive the practice of public health in health departments in cities or municipalities or even the country. And from there, when I was working in Georgia, I had a chance to work with, I'm aging myself here, I guess, but I had a chance to work with the Master Settlement Agreement, the Big Tobacco Settlement Agreement across the country. And during that time, there were sort of two groups of individuals getting together to decide what the damages were in terms of health impact, cost. And those two parties were epidemiologists and the National Association of Attorney Generals. So I had the opportunity to be in a lot of meetings with a lot of attorneys and just sort of observing and participating somewhat, but I was still a junior epidemiologist. I think I was more paying attention, observing, but also I had the responsibility of the first installation of those dollars. The first and second year, I think, installation of those dollars for Georgia, I was responsible for how it was going to be distributed across the counties in Georgia. So I thought I better pay a lot of attention. From there, I became really more intrigued and probably fascinated of how the two different sides thought and how a lot of the thinking was more parallel than one would expect, usually just different routes to get to the same point, learning a lot about injury law, things like that. And so from there, I did a summer institute at University of Michigan And I took a course, and that was called Epidemiology in the Law. And that was a week. It was about 10 people, small seminar, 5 attorneys, 5 epidemiologists. And it was there I got the opportunity to really go into the rabbit hole. And we, both parties did, in terms of the attorneys, to sort of learn how we think about different injuries and outcomes and what that looks like and what does causation look like, right? Because the big piece that holds law together in epidemiology is their theoretical frameworks for causation of death or injury in epidemiology, and the causation of harm in tort law, which could also be death, obviously. So from there, after Michigan, I was sold, and I knew that my next stint was to do a PhD and a JD. I just had to figure out how to make it work.
So did you do them concurrently then?
No, so I did this thing that's called coordinated approach, right? So you have sort of 2 things. There's 3 sort of avenues to doing this. So a lot of the PhD, JD programs, they haven't been around the same length of time as maybe MD, PhDs. So you don't have a lot of formalized joint programs at 2 schools, a School of Public Health and a School of Law at a university. And for the area where it is the most developed, it's generally in law and clinical psych and forensic psych. I knew that I did not want a degree in psychology, and I knew that I wanted my PhD in epidemiology. So if you don't do a joint program, then it's what's called the concurrent process, which you just alluded to. And the concurrent process is, it's not a joint program, but the university has a law school and a School of Public Health, and you have to apply to both. And then you sort of coordinate it internally, but you're doing it concurrently, right? And then the third way, which is the least friendliest way, which is the way that I had to go, it was more of a coordinated, meaning it was consecutive, but I had to do all the coordination up front, or I chose to, because I then realized that I would have to get my PhD from one school, my JD from another. So I had to do all the legwork up front in terms of the LSATs, the GREs, so that I could not be interrupted with the LSAT while I was in grad school. And then it became consecutive, which is probably the most difficult one to manage. And I wouldn't recommend it unless you really, really want it.
Are you glad you have it now?
Yeah, I am. I mean, I was, at some points when you're in those processes, whether, it's law school, medical school, or getting your PhD, it becomes the bane of your existence. But even while in it, I never regretted my decision. One of the things I like about school, and when you're doing a degree program, you do get a chance to sort of immerse yourself in it and to think critically and creatively, and to be a little bit more intellectually provocative, which sometimes it's more challenging to do when you're in a workspace.
I can imagine that you are ideally suited to your position at the Multnomah County Health Department with your educational background. I assume that they are very pleased to have you.
I hope so. I believe they are. I'm very happy to work with them. It's a great place to work.
Speaking of working, what is something that you wish people knew about being a scientist?
It's funny. We again, until the pandemic, I don't feel like we were so popular. We're like everybody else. I think obviously there's some characteristics about people who self-select into any vocation. So there's some things about us that are similar. We often are heady. We're very modest about the work. People are very interested in the work. One of my practice areas is forensic epidemiology. I don't like talking about it because it can really become the subject matter itself. I mean, we're very committed to the work, but I don't think we like a lot of the spotlight on it in terms of how people sort of, but they sort of make it seem like a television show, particularly the forensic stuff. But we like everybody else. We like to have fun, and travel and enjoy friends and college football games, the usual stuff.
I didn't know about the forensic epidemiology, and now I want to ask you a bunch of questions, but you just said that I shouldn't, so I'm not going to. Maybe we can have a conversation later about that.
Yeah.
This may be the first time some of our listeners have heard you speak, and many of our audience may not be aware that you are an African-American man. And what is something that you wish people knew about being an African-American scientist?
I think, and I'm going to speak because the question is sort of scoped in terms of scientists, but it probably holds true for some of my other friends who hold doctoral degrees in other areas. We go into this space understanding that there are not a lot of people who have doctoral degrees. More specifically, even fewer people who have PhDs. when you then pare that down to the number of African Americans with doctoral degrees, then the number of African Americans with PhDs, the number of African American males with doctoral degrees, and then with PhDs, and if they have a dual doctorate in something, the room gets really, 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 really small. Although our white counterparts, and I believe, everyone works hard, it is not an easy path, regardless of your race or ethnicity. But the experience, again, for African Americans is a little different, not only in the process, but even post the process. And largely, that's not necessarily due to this idea of competency, or this gradient of competency between two parties, whites or people of color or African Americans. In getting these degrees, like many things, there's this, what I call a social navigation in the process that a lot of times, and this occurs for African American students in higher education, they don't really have anyone to model or guide them to navigate the social aspects of that. And when I say social, I don't mean necessarily just having fun, but it's more understanding the on the ground social politics, to understand what is being said when it is not said, how to navigate the no towards a yes, learning how to make the relationships and understanding the different threads that have to be sewn in order to develop those relationships in those particular settings. And it often mimics the very same thing you see in elementary school again, but although you don't get suspended, but you get a narrative. A narrative is then woven about you because you don't really understand how to navigate the culture, that culture. And so often we get into these institutions, or we get into these programs, and we may not successfully matriculate, or it's like I always say, just because, someone invites you to the house, that doesn't mean you're having a good time. Doesn't mean you have dinner. You could be at the party. It doesn't mean that you danced, right? Or it's like being invited to the party, but being forced to be on the wall. And so they don't successfully matriculate, or the matriculation experience is so negative that afterwards they really don't want anything to do with it. And so I have a lot of friends who say, I'm a recovering attorney, I'm a recovering what have you. And then it goes on post-graduation, right? It's just the nature of the field. And even to this day, and it's what I call the benefit burden distribution, where my white counterparts, more often than not, they receive a certain benefit of the doubt, right? Where I have to bear the burden of the scrutiny and legitimacy of my training, legitimacy of my thinking, even though I may have gone to the number one school of public health in the world, arguably, there's still an interrogation in terms of the legitimacy of my training that I, again, have to go through. And it's never overt, but being in those spaces long enough, you get to see it. And that can be very disheartening, also very frustrating. And it doesn't support someone wanting to stay or develop a career in that space, or at least developing a career in the more traditional pathways. And even to this day, I mean, Amanda, I probably get something like that every week or every other week.
That is disheartening. And yeah, my hope with these interviews is to tell your stories and give you the opportunity to let people know what your experiences are. So even though I'm, one small little piece of the puzzle. So on related to that, would you be willing to talk about your personal experience with what we were discussing before, with the related to racism, poverty, and public health, perhaps prior to your university education, or whatever you want to talk about in that respect?
You mean my exposures to racism, or
yeah,
unpack that for me a little bit.
Sure. You obviously were one of the children who had the opportunity to pass the third grade phenomenon that you were describing earlier, and learned how to read to learn. But I'm sure that your childhood, you had was affected by some of the things that we were describing earlier. And I don't want to ask you to share anything that is too personal, but I think that our audience is largely white, and I want to give you an opportunity to tell our largely white audience, if you want to, what it's like growing up as a African-American kid who then goes on to be an epidemiologist and a lawyer.
I'll give you a story that may sort of, I think, get at that. You don't know, I guess the audience doesn't know. I'm originally from the East Coast. So, and I've had the fortunate opportunity to live really all over the country and even some brief stints outside the country. So I figured I had it all sort of under control. And then I moved out to the Pacific Northwest, and it was a little different for me. And there was still a lot to learn, even though I had moved and lived in many cities. So on one hand, it was bad because I underestimated it, but on the other hand, it was good because it kept me, sharp, right? With that said, one of the things one of those words or phrases that I heard so much here that I had never heard in any other city, whether it was New York, Maryland, DC, Philly, Atlanta, Alabama. I just never heard it. This idea about being safe, right? Feeling safe. Do you feel safe? And what safety is, and it comes up a lot in the workplace, and it kept coming up. You want to have a safe space, and can you be safe? And I was like, wow, what is this thing about safe, right? Why is that a distraction for me? Number one, and then number two, sort of why does it seem to sort of permeate this space more than I've ever imagined or had ever experienced? So I was doing a training one day at work, and the subject matter came up again, and I had to really reflect on sort of, and it was sort of around a human resource thing. Do you feel safe to sort of engage your superiors or your boss, and how to navigate tough situations, things like that?
And that's here in Multnomah County, or in?
Well, the training was in Multnomah County, but it was just a sort of not a random, but it was a training, a standard training that we go through. So it wasn't about Multnomah County. You may have gotten the training anywhere else. It just happened to be in Multnomah County. And how to sort of manage situations and develop. It's about team building, basically. And so in order to sort of build a team and have a certain level of cohesion, the message was, you have to create safe spaces for development, growth, things of that nature. So there was an exercise there about sort of give examples where you felt safe, give examples where you didn't feel safe, something to that effect. And by this time, I had already been giving it a lot of thought about this idea of safety and why it was sort of a distraction for me. And my experience is because here, where again, I've heard the most, safe is like a trigger word, right? Maybe it's my training in the law, but it's also a trigger word because what it says to me, and what I believe it says parenthetically, is if you don't feel safe, that means you must feel threatened. And so someone's conduct is threatening you, right? And legally, that is an assault, even though there's no physical, right? It can be an assault, right? Depending on the fact pattern, of course. And so when I hear particularly African white men or even white women, I've been trained and socialized enough to know that when someone, particularly if it's a white woman, says she doesn't feel safe, I know that means if she's talking about me, which I've never had that, but I'm saying it puts me on this sort of vigilance, right? You don't feel safe, that means you feel threatened. Then the question becomes, what did I do? What's happening here? So I think about it in terms of legal terms. I think about it in terms of being threatened versus not threatened. So I struggle with being able to sort of identify spaces where I have not felt safe. And during this exercise, I had to really had to think like what opportunities or what experiences where I didn't feel safe. And I couldn't come up with one. Then I felt a little awkward about, or somewhat embarrassed about sort of, well, that's ridiculous, right? We all should have an experience where you didn't feel safe, right? That means you must feel like you're a super tough guy. You never, which it wasn't that, but I was like, if I say that out loud, that's not going to come off believable. And so we had a break in this session. I went back to my office and I tried to go back. And I was going back through my childhood. I was like, when is it that I don't feel safe? Again, translating it as threatened. And I couldn't come up with one. Then I realized, and this is where I sort of had this emotional revelation. I realized that I had never felt safe, but I couldn't have, as an African-American male, you can't afford not to feel safe. And so when I say that I've never felt safe, it doesn't mean that I've never felt safe in my home, my family. I've always felt safe in my neighborhood, my friends, and things like that. So it wasn't sort of this unstable housing or a bad childhood, so to speak. But as an African American, you're sort of inculcated with this theme that you don't expect the world to be safe to you or for you. And you can't afford to expect that, because when you expect that, then that's where things go awry. So for me, this idea of feeling safe was always an expectation of not necessarily that I was going to be threatened, but I wasn't surprised. I didn't look for it. And it wasn't a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I don't want people to go down that road either. But you learn as a sort of a suit of armor that when you walk out that door and when you go to school and when you go through neighborhood and you get on the subway, there are things that can come if you're not paying attention, right? And so then it was emotional for me, because I realized I had never allowed myself the feeling of comfort. Because I often tell people, if I was distracted by feeling safe, I wouldn't be here talking to you, Amanda, right? Because the discomfort that I had to navigate as a child, that I have to navigate as an African American man, and then the career decisions I made, it's constantly uncomfortable. And some of that is just a normal part, your first time doing something, right? But there's always this sort of constant, again, scrutiny, which makes you feel uncomfortable, right? Makes you feel unsafe. But for me, that was just a part of the bargain. That's on par for the course. You expect that. So I think it was disheartening for me in that moment that I had never been afforded that opportunity, or it was more of a luxury that I did not allow myself, or was not a part of my narrative, just because you have to anticipate that as an African-American male, a lot of spaces are welcoming, but a lot of spaces aren't. And when we talk about this racism thing, and I've had a lot of support from my non-Black friends or my white counterparts. And one of the things I told them and told my team is that, maybe I don't experience racism every day, but I promise you, it's 52 weeks out of the year, whether I'm in my neighborhood, whether I'm at the office. And so it's not that African Americans or Black people are walking around sort of like ready to jump off the curb. It just becomes a part of your experience, like breathing. And that for me was very sad to realize, here I am all my adult life. And the reason I struggle with this idea of safe is because unless it's actual and a physical threat, I'm good. But what people are talking about here, what I come to learn, it was this space of being uncomfortable. But I always had to sort of be able to manage being uncomfortable, being the only Black guy, being the only Black male, being the only student going here, just being that guy, that Black guy. Or there's one more Black person in the classroom, and that's a girl, right? And we're sitting in this lecture hall for immunology. So we might see two people, and then of course we become friends, right? So I don't know if that gets at your question in terms of sort of my childhood. And it came out in middle school, and, elementary school teachers not really setting low expectations for me and things like that. So yeah, I'm not sure if that helped, made it more blurry or made it more clear.
I think the entire situation is blurry, but I appreciate you sharing your experience, because I can see a piece of that being a woman and always having to be on guard. There are spaces where I think I feel safe,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't want to conflate our two experiences. I'm just trying to relate it to my own. And yeah, that's got to be exhausting.
It can be.
I'm trying to figure out a good follow-up question, because that was really powerful. With the protests that are going on right now, what do you think is going to happen? Are you hopeful? Are you expecting nothing to change? Do you have anything you would like to share? And if you don't, that's fine.
I would say no. Actually, I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. I think one of the things that I noticed in this particular scenario of protests that were sparked by the death of George Floyd, but also other individuals, when I saw the protest in other countries, when I saw a mural of George Floyd on the Berlin Wall, I felt that this was something different. So I think that this is a shift. And because of that shift, or that sense of this pivoting, I feel cautiously optimistic, but I certainly don't feel, or at least I don't have any evidence in front of me to put me in a situation to think that nothing is going to change, or that things will remain the same, pre the death of George Floyd or the murder of George Floyd. So the first observation was sort of the protests around the world, which I had never seen that before. Unfortunately, we know we have many murders of unarmed Black men and Black women that have occurred. I'm just going to say in the last 5 years, right? I can just go there, that did not spark this type of response. I also noticed, or I've observed, how certain things have changed dramatically quickly. So, for instance, in some states, in some municipalities, the leadership has had the courage to make June 19th a holiday, which I applaud them for that, including Multnomah County. And I reflect back on, it took us maybe 10 years, give or take, when I started noticing it, to get Martin Luther King, to get that to be a holiday. It took us like a long time. And then some states still just held out for it to be a King holiday. And all of a sudden, it's Juneteenth in 3 days. It's like, wow, okay. Another reason outside of sort of the observation of the protests, or sort of some sense of legislative mandates or proposals that are being put forward, I think the response is an acknowledgement. And sometimes I say this in my talks. We think about racism and race relations as we have a tendency to think about it anyway, as this sort of binary dynamic, like an on-off switch, or, you get sick, you take a pill, right? How do we fix it? How do we turn the light off? I know it sounds a little pessimistic, but I don't think it's something that you fix per se. At least I don't see that in my lifetime. Meaning, if fixing means to extinguish it in its totality, I don't know. It's so heavily baked into our system. The response and the protest, and as well as the sort of confluence of other groups coming together to support one another, whether it's people whose civil rights have been impacted because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, other racial and ethnic groups, other religious groups coming together, standing together in the streets of many, many cities across the world. It demonstrates that, I would like to believe, an acknowledgement of this racism, and that it is not going to go anywhere. And it has to be owned. It has to be understood and constantly engaged and constantly looked at, and constantly using that lens of equity, particularly around race and ethnicity, when we look at other systems, such as all the underinvestment we have done really in the human aspect of our existence, right? We spend a lot of money with the militarization of the police. I'm not anti-police. I have a lot of good friends, and that sounds really trite, but no, I know there are a lot of good police out there. But I also know that we've made an overinvestment in militarizing the police, and an underinvestment in those same communities, or even not a shared investment, right? Investing so that there's more cooperative agreements between the police and the communities, and have them work together. It's not necessarily putting all the money in the police department or putting all the money into the community. How do we put the money so that it kind of hopefully creates an environment where they have to work together to solve and identify problems? But for us to have success in moving forward, and for us not to regress backwards, you have to own it and realize that it's something you have to watch for all the time. And the perfect example that I always give are two examples. It's been over 50 years since the Brown versus Board of Education, but schools are still segregated. It's been over, I should know this, but I don't know how many years, since Roe v. Wade. But there's still a constant assault against women's rights when it comes down to an abortion. So it's not an on-off switch where you pass a law and you go home and forget about it. So you have to own, and people have a right to feel how they feel, whether it's about abortion or whatever, right? You can't turn it on and off. And you can't look at it as something to end, and then it becomes like a coffee table subject. It's a part of who we are, and we have to constantly manage it so that it doesn't become even more destructive. That was a long answer, I know. Sorry.
No, I appreciate you sharing your thoughts, and that's why I wanted to do this interview, because I, as a white woman, don't even fully understand the problems. And I want to know more. And I hope that, well, if our listeners have gotten this far in the podcast, hopefully they want to know more too. So,
yeah.
So,
and lastly, I'm hopeful because a lot of the problems are messy and challenging, but I believe more of them are solvable than not.
I hope so. Well, I think on that positive note, I will say thank you to Dr. Frank Franklin for joining us on the podcast today and for sharing his personal thoughts about so many things. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening, and we'd love to hear from you. If you learned something today, or if you have any questions about the podcast or suggestions for scientists we should interview, please send us an email. Our address is info@scibarpodcast.org. If you'd like to help keep these podcasts and our online events free for everyone, we'd be grateful for donations of any size. I'll put links to our one-time donation and Patreon pages in the episode notes. I also want to encourage you to contact the Black Lives Matter organization or other groups that are working to help serve and protect people of color in the United States. They could definitely use your donations of time or money right now. Finally, I want to say thank you to Molly Franks for introducing me to Dr. Franklin in the first place. Thanks to my producer, Graham, for dealing with all the recording weirdness, and to Jonathan Coulton for the use of his song Mandelbrot Set for our theme music.
Just